"Sit down, boy." That's all she said. Not a scream, not a threat. Just 3 words. Calm, deliberate, and soaked in centuries of venom. The room froze, not from confusion, but from recognition. Because in that moment, power didn't whisper, it spat. And she didn't say it to end the conversation. She said it to end him. But here's what she didn't expect. He didn't flinch. He stood. And when he opened his mouth, the silence broke, and history cracked open with it. He didn't ask to speak. He didn't demand the spotlight. Denzel Washington had taken his seat the way he'd always done when real stakes were on the table, quietly, deliberately, and with both hands open. But this room wasn't built for quiet, and it sure as hell wasn't ready for him. The committee chamber was packed, every seat filled with suits and smirks. On paper, this was a bipartisan hearing on systemic inequality in education and law enforcement. An attempt, or so they said, to bridge the gap between policy and lived reality. But the moment Denzel stepped in, reality didn't just enter, it unsettled. He didn't wear a power tie. No folder full of stats, no carefully rehearsed statements, just a plain charcoal suit, worn not for vanity, but clarity. He came not as a movie star, but as a representative of a grassroots civil rights coalition, one that had spent the last 2 years gathering testimonies from Black and Latino families wronged by the very institutions seated before him. Karoline Leavitt, the committee's newest rising star, young, blonde, media-savvy, and armed with the kind of conservative venom that played well on late-night cable, watched him take his seat with the patience of a fox before a kill. The chairwoman had barely finished introducing the panel when Karoline leaned toward her mic, eyes sharp and voice sugar-laced with steel. "Excuse me, who let the actor in?" A ripple of laughter bounced off the walls like pennies tossed into an empty bucket. A few aides chuckled behind their clipboards. One congressman shook his head with a grin, as if to say, "Here we go." But Denzel didn't laugh. He didn't move. He turned to her, not with fury, not with offense, but with a stare so steady it peeled the room down to silence. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen that smirk before, in casting rooms, in hotel lobbies, in police cars through rearview mirrors. It was the smirk that came from those convinced they already knew your story, because they helped write the version the world saw. Karoline, emboldened by the reaction, pressed on. "I just think it's ironic that we're discussing policy and enforcement, and yet we're giving the mic to someone who's made millions pretending to be someone else. This isn't a movie, Mr. Washington." She leaned back like a queen making checkmate, but Denzel didn't blink. He pressed his fingertips together, as if weighing her words, then spoke in that quiet, deliberate tone that could hush a storm. "You're right," he said. "This isn't a movie, because in movies, the bad guys at least get a redemption arc." The laughter stopped. Dead silence. A few eyebrows raised. Somewhere in the back, a camera lens zoomed in with purpose. Karoline narrowed her eyes, caught off guard not by anger, but by clarity, because Denzel hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't attacked. He just held up a mirror, and she didn't like what she saw. The chairwoman, attempting to regain order, shuffled her notes and gestured to proceed with opening remarks. But the tension already had claws, and Karoline wasn't about to let go. She shot back. "So tell us, Mr. Washington, what exactly qualifies an actor to lecture us on race, crime, and constitutional policy? Was it your role in Training Day or American Gangster that gave you such insights into justice?" A few more laughs. Tighter this time, more nervous, like people chuckling while watching a lit match drop into gasoline. Denzel exhaled slowly, then leaned toward the mic, not to defend, but to state, "I've been to more funerals than premieres in the last 5 years. I've held mothers who couldn't bury their sons because the system lost their bodies. I've sat with teenagers expelled for the crime of having a hoodie and hope. And I've walked through communities where the law doesn't serve, it just surveys. So no, I don't speak because I played a cop. I speak because I've buried more justice than you've ever met." And that's when the room shifted. That's when the smirks faded. Because it wasn't a soundbite. It wasn't showbiz. It was lived, raw, undeniable. But Karoline wasn't done. Her smile curled again, this time thinner, colder. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, and with the ease of someone about to drop a bomb, whispered into the mic, "Well, sit down, boy." You could hear a pin drop. Even the air recoiled. Not because she said it loud, but because she meant it deep. It wasn't just condescension. It was coded, loaded, lethal. A word that had once been used to chain, to silence, to remind black men of where they didn't belong. And now it had just been fired across a federal hearing room, on live television, like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And in that breathless moment, Denzel stood, slowly, silently. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand. He just looked at her, like a man who had just felt history slap him one more time and decided this time it would not go unanswered. Because what came next wasn't a reaction. It was the start of reckoning. The silence after, "Sit down, boy," hung in the air like tear gas. It didn't just sting, it branded. Cameras held their breath. Staffers stiffened. A woman in the front row slowly lowered her notepad. Every breath in the room became a question. Did she just say that? Yes, she did. And she meant it. Denzel didn't move. Not right away, because some words don't land like punches. They land like history, layered, sharp, deliberate. Boy wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a message, aimed not just at him, but at every man who'd ever been told to know his place in a room he helped build. He could have exploded. He didn't. Instead, he adjusted his cuff, glanced at the mic, and spoke. Not loud, but low. The kind of voice that made people lean in instead of pull away. "I've been called worse, but not in a room that claims to care about justice." Karoline leaned back, unfazed, unfurled a perfectly rehearsed smirk like a flag at war. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she scoffed. "You've made a career out of pretending to be victims and heroes. Don't confuse that with being one." A few soft chuckles tried to resurface. They didn't last. Denzel tilted his head. "Sometimes pretending to be brave is the first step toward actually being brave," he said, voice steady as stone. "Something you might want to try." The air tightened. Somewhere, someone coughed just to break the tension. Karoline sat forward again, hands clasped, her tone now edged in ice. "Let's be real. You're here because you're famous, not qualified. Because media wants a spectacle, not solutions. Because America loves a well-spoken black man, as long as he stays in character." She paused, let the words sizzle. Then, with the precision of a scalpel, added, "You don't represent victims. You represent ratings." This time there was no laughter, just the unmistakable crack of something ancient and angry waking up. Denzel didn't take the bait. He simply looked around the room, at the aides, the interns, the lawmakers who wore empathy like an accessory. Then he said, "I don't need to be a policy expert to know that a mother bearing her son doesn't ask for credentials. She asks for someone to show up, and I did. Not to speak for her, but to make sure you hear her." He looked back at Karoline. "You've built a career weaponizing performance, so don't come for mine like you don't recognize the script." That's when Karoline's composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but visible. She picked up a folder, flipped it open, and waved a photo into the air. A still image from training day, Denzel in full LAPD gear, holding a gun. "This is who we're taking moral advice from?" she said, her voice rising for the first time. "A man who glorified corruption? A fictional cop who murdered people on screen? Maybe the committee would like to hear from Tony Montana next." Somebody shifted in their chair. Someone else whispered, "That's low." Denzel didn't look at the photo. He didn't need to. Because what Karoline failed to understand, what people like her always failed to understand, was that fiction may entertain, but truth endures. So he leaned into the mic again, calm as a storm's eye. "I played a dirty cop so you'd know what one looks like." Karoline blinked. Just once. Denzel continued, "I took roles that held a mirror to the very system you're now defending with a smile. And I took that mirror into prisons, schools, and courtrooms, so that the people who lived that reality could finally see themselves reflected, not erased." His voice hardened, not louder but deeper. "And if that scares you, maybe it should. A woman 2 rows behind Caroline nodded slowly. One of the interns clenched her jaw. The spell was breaking. Caroline tried to recover, pulling her smile tight again, like a mask made of steel and makeup. She leaned forward, voice now dripping with forced authority. "Mr. Washington, this hearing is about facts, not feelings." He shot back without hesitation. "No, Ms. Levitt, this hearing is about denial. And the facts? They're buried under the feelings you don't want to admit you helped create." For the first time all morning, she had no comeback. And for the first time in years, the entire nation leaned in, not to watch a performance, but a reckoning. What she thought would be a public humiliation had become a moral reveal, because in trying to reduce him to a role, she'd exposed her own. Not a lawmaker, not a leader, just another actor. In a system that punishes the real for speaking louder than the script. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw his chair. He didn't storm out. Instead, Denzel Washington stood slowly, silently, like a mountain rising in the middle of a storm. The room didn't move. Every pair of eyes locked on him. The only sound was the subtle click of cameras adjusting their focus, unsure whether they were documenting a hearing or a historic turning point. He walked forward, not in anger, but in reckoning. His footsteps didn't echo, but somehow they shook the floor. He reached the microphone like a man who'd been waiting his whole life to speak, not for himself, but for all those who'd never been given a mic at all. Then he spoke. "I've been sitting for 400 years, he said, pausing just long enough to let the words dig in, while others stood tall, on our backs. The temperature in the room changed. It wasn't heat, it was weight. I sat while my great-grandfather was beaten for looking too long. I sat while my father was passed over for jobs he trained others to do. I sat while a little boy in Ferguson bled out on concrete under the summer sun. I sat while the headlines changed, but the bodies stayed the same." He looked directly at Karoline. "But today, I stand. Not a ripple, not a cough. Just the kind of silence that doesn't come from respect, but realization. I don't stand as an actor," he continued, his voice slow and razor clean. "I stand as a witness to what your words do. Not to me. To those who can't clap back on live TV. To the kid who hears boy in a classroom and doesn't know whether to cry, fight, or swallow it. To the father who watches his son come home more silent every day because the world keeps telling him he's less." Caroline sat motionless. No smirk, no rebuttal. Her eyes searched for an ally, but every head was forward, watching, listening, judging. Denzel adjusted the mic, gently, like even the equipment deserved gentleness in a world that had so little of it. "I've seen the damage done when words like yours are treated like jokes, when microaggressions become macro silences, when dignity becomes optional, depending on the color of the speaker." His tone sharpened, not in volume, but precision. "And I didn't come here to act. I've already played 1,000 roles. But today, I came here to unmask the one you play." A few audible gasps. One senator dropped his pen. A woman on the far left blinked back tears she hadn't expected. Caroline opened her mouth, then shut it again, because something shifted, not in the script, but in the room itself. It wasn't just Denzel standing. It was every teacher who'd been called aggressive for raising her voice once. It was every teenager followed through a store for wearing a hoodie. It was every man who'd been told to lower his tone while watching his humanity shrink behind a smile. And it wasn't just what Denzel said, it was how he said it. He didn't perform. He peeled, he didn't debate, he delivered. And for the first time, this wasn't a hearing. It was a truth-telling, and America was listening. "Respect him," he said quietly, "is not about liking someone. It's about recognizing their worth. Even if you disagree, especially if you disagree. And today you disrespected a room full of people by reducing lived pain to performance." Then slowly he looked around the room. At each lawmaker, each aide, each journalist waiting to pounce or praise. "I've been called a lot of things, he added, "but I've earned every name by standing where I was told to kneel." A beat. Then he turned back to Caroline. "And if that frightens you, good. It means we're finally getting somewhere." The silence that followed was different. Not the silence of shock, but the silence that comes when something undeniable has just been said, and no one has the courage to look away. The room had barely caught its breath from Denzel's testimony when the real aftershock hit. Not inside the chamber, but across the screens of every living room, news desk, and phone in America. It started with a quiet leak, one anonymous post, a grainy, time-stamped photo buried deep in a forgotten blog, uploaded years ago. Scrubbed, deleted, memory hold. But history doesn't die. It waits. And when the photo resurfaced, it didn't whisper. It roared. There she was, Karoline Levitt, 18 years old, at a college party titled Back to the Plantation. A costume party. A joke, they called it. She stood front and center, plastic chains draped around her neck, lips exaggerated with black grease paint, wearing a tattered mockery of a house servant's dress, grinning, frozen in time, unapologetically cruel. The image exploded through social media like a detonation. Every network scrambled. Every morning anchor braced themselves. Screens flashed side-by-side comparisons. Karoline today, polished and poised, versus Karoline then, grinning in mockery of an entire people's pain. The statement came quickly. She faced the cameras the next morning in a crisp navy blazer, her voice polished to mechanical empathy. I was young. I was stupid. I regret it. Deeply. The words were correct, but the face was unreadable. No tremble, no break, just calibrated remorse. Denzel watched the press conference from a side room in the Capitol. The journalists swarmed like bees, but his expression didn't change. Because he'd seen it before. The performance of apology, the theater of, I didn't mean it, carefully timed to extinguish outrage before it grew teeth. Later that day, back in the chamber, Karoline took her seat again, chin high. The buzz was deafening, but she sat like she hadn't just been unmasked in front of a nation. The chairwoman tapped her gavel. Silence settled, and Denzel stood, not with fury, with clarity. He walked to the mic with the calm of a man who spent a lifetime waiting for people to show their true colors. He didn't hold up the photo. He didn't name the party. He didn't need to. He looked at Karoline. She looked back, barely. Then he said, I'm not here to crucify a child for being raised in the wrong room. That line made people shift in their seats. I'm not here to dig up your sins. They already surfaced. Karoline braced. I'm here to question what you've done since. He paused. Not for drama, for weight. Regret is not a press conference. It's not a statement crafted by a team of consultants and filtered through a teleprompter. Regret has a pulse. It bleeds. It costs you. A quiet hum passed through the room. Denzel stepped closer to the microphone. You say you were young and stupid. That's fine. We've all been stupid. But tell me this. Where is the scholarship fund you started for the kids mocked in that photo? Where are the visits to the communities you once laughed at? Where is the work that proves you regret what you did? He looked her in the eyes now, voice neither harsh nor soft, but surgical. Because right now, all I see is a woman trying to erase a past she hasn't repaid. A low murmur rippled across the chamber. Journalists whispered notes into their recorders. The chairwoman didn't move. Denzel turned to face the room. You see, the danger isn't just in what she once wore. It's in the fact that she rose to power by pretending it never happened and by attacking others for daring to speak truth. He let the silence grow thick again. And I ask you, if that's not a performance, then what is? Karoline didn't reply. Couldn't. Her carefully constructed armor was cracking, not because of the photo, but because someone had refused to let her rewrite the ending. Denzel stepped back, slow and measured. I don't believe in canceling people. I believe in confronting them. And if you're going to walk into this room with a mic and a memory, then you better expect both to come for you when you lie. And with that, he sat, not in defeat, but like a man who no longer had to stand to be heard. The chairwoman cleared her throat, stunned into stillness. The cameras were still rolling, and outside the headlines were already printing themselves. The actor spoke, the pretender folded. The next day, the hearing room was more crowded than ever. Cameras were already humming before the first gavel struck. Not because anything was scheduled, but because everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know from where. Karoline arrived early, her usual self-assured gait now slightly muted, heels not clicking as loudly, makeup a little heavier, as if it could shield her from the weight of what had been exposed. She avoided the press outside. She avoided the eyes inside. She even avoided her own reflection in the glass. Denzel arrived quietly. No entourage. No dramatic entrance. Just the same charcoal suit, the same calm stillness, the same unwillingness to perform. He sat in the back this time, behind the second row, letting the silence speak louder than any prepared speech could. Then the unexpected happened. A door at the side of the chamber opened, not the usual entrance for officials or staffers, and from it stepped a woman, not young, not polished, not invited. She was black, in her late 60s, wearing a simple gray cardigan and long dark skirt. No makeup, no entourage, just a framed photo clutched tightly to her chest, her fingers trembling, but not from fear, from the weight of memory. No one stopped her. Something in her presence made even the security guards pause, like they sensed this moment belonged to her. She walked slowly toward the center and without a word turned toward the committee. All cameras tilted, all whispers died. She held up the photo. It was of a boy, maybe 12 years old, smiling with two missing teeth, standing next to a battered blue bicycle, his eyes full of life, his right arm in a heavy cast. "My name is Rosa Daniels," she said, voice shaking but proud. "And this is my son, Malik." No one moved. He was 12 when a police officer broke his arm because he thought Malik had stolen this bicycle. She held the photo higher. It wasn't stolen. It was his. He just didn't have the receipt. Who carries a receipt for a birthday gift? Her voice cracked. She took a breath. They said it was a misunderstanding. No charges filed, no apology, just a boy with a broken arm and a message burned into his bones. This world doesn't see you as a child. It sees you as a threat. Karoline looked up briefly, then immediately back down. Ms. Daniels continued. "I went to lawyers. No one took the case, said it was too small, said it would cost too much, said no jury would care." Then she looked toward the back of the room, at Denzel. But one man did. Gas fluttered through the crowd like sparks. He didn't put it on Twitter. He didn't call the press. He didn't even tell me who he was at first, just said, "You shouldn't have to fight this alone." And then he fought. For us. Paid for everything. Got us all the way to the Supreme Court, won a settlement, and more important, made them say his name, in court, out loud. She paused, eyes shining. Not an actor, a savior. The room exhaled all at once. Denzel didn't move. He didn't blink. But something in his eyes shimmered. Not pride, not pain, something heavier. The exhaustion of someone who had carried too many stories in silence. Karoline was stone. Her hands clenched tight on the table, but she said nothing. For the first time, her entire arsenal, snark, sarcasm, statistics, was useless. Because this wasn't about ideology. This was about legacy. The woman turned back to the panel. "I came here today not for politics, not for sound bites. I came to remind you that the real heroes don't ask for microphones. They don't dress it up. They just show up." She looked once more at Denzel. "Thank you." Then she walked out. No applause, no cameras chased her, just a hush that clung to the walls like smoke. And in that stillness, something irreversible happened. The room saw Denzel, not as a celebrity, not as a performer, but as what he truly was. A man who didn't just play justice, he delivered it, quietly, consistently, without needing to be seen. That silence hit Karoline harder than any headline, because now every word she'd ever used to tear him down suddenly felt weightless, against a truth that needed no defense. And as the chairwoman finally tapped the gavel again, trying to bring the room back to order, everyone knew. The real order had already changed. He didn't ask for an apology, not from Karoline, not from the committee, not from the country that watched him get called boy on national television and stayed quiet a little too long. Because Denzel Washington knew something deeper than vengeance. He knew the difference between noise and change. So when he stood again, this time not with fire but with focus, he didn't raise his fist. He raised a proposal, a quiet stack of papers, 3 pages, unmarked, no branding. Just a title scrawled across the front, Bias Accountability Framework for Government Communications. The room blinked, confused at first. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a speech. It was a blueprint. Denzel walked it to the front, placed it gently before the chairwoman, then turned to the panel. "I'm not here to demand an apology," he said, voice low but sharp. "Apologies don't save lives. Policies do." He gestured to the papers. "This is a framework, a starting point, a system of filters and accountability procedures designed to prevent discriminatory language from becoming official rhetoric. Not just for hearings like this, but for press conferences, for federal memos, for everything that touches the public eye." He turned slightly, just enough to look at Karoline, who sat frozen in her seat, hands folded tightly as if trying to hold on to the last of her relevance. "This isn't about her," he said. "This is about what happens when her words go unchecked." No one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because they understood that to interrupt now would be to stand against something irrefutably overdue. He continued, "Language is policy's shadow. What we say at this table becomes what people believe at theirs. And if we let hatred slide through our microphones, it will find its way into our schools, our prisons, our laws. We've already seen it." He held the room without raising his voice, without a single gesture of self-righteousness. "I'm not an expert in legislation," he said, "but I am an expert in what happens when it fails." Then simply he sat, and the room stood. It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't dramatic. One by one, without cue or script, lawmakers, left, right, centrist, rose to their feet. Not in applause, but in silent agreement. Karoline didn't stand. She didn't move. Her world, once loud with control, had grown impossibly quiet. By the end of that week, the framework had been fast-tracked for review. A special subcommittee formed on the spot put it on the legislative docket under emergency ethics protocol. The final vote came 10 days later. The House passed it. The Senate, stunned by the momentum, followed. The president signed it. And just like that, for the first time in modern history, a non-elected figure, a so-called actor, had authored the moral spark that became federal law. The headlines couldn't keep up. Washington rewrites Washington. Hollywood star turns civil servant. The man who refused to sit changed the system. And Karoline? She didn't go quietly, but she went. Within days of the bill's passage, her office released a sterile PR scrub statement about stepping back to reflect. But behind the scenes, it was carnage. Her top advisors pulled out. Donors withdrew. Her contract with 2 major networks was quietly dissolved. Even her mentor, the congressman who once called her the future of American conservatism, declined to appear beside her at a scheduled conference. "Optics," his aide whispered. "We're not dying on that hill," she called. He didn't answer, because the game was over. Not just for her, but for the version of politics she represented. The version where cruelty dressed up as courage, where sarcasm masqueraded as strategy, where power didn't serve, it performed. And now in its place stood something rare, accountability born not from outrage, but from truth delivered with surgical precision. Denzel never returned to the chamber. He didn't need to. He had left behind something louder than his presence, a law, a legacy, and the unmistakable echo of one final truth. You don't have to raise your voice to raise a nation. A year had passed. The headlines had faded. The firestorm had cooled into ash. Capitol Hill had moved on, as it always did, from scandal to scandal, soundbite to soundbite, outrage to oblivion. But some stories don't stay buried. They simmer beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to ask, did it mean anything? So when Denzel Washington agreed to a rare, televised sit-down, no script, no PR filter, just a black chair in a quiet studio, the world tuned in, not for gossip, but for clarity. The interviewer, a respected journalist with decades under her belt, leaned forward with practiced calm and asked, "Looking back now, do you regret it? That confrontation with Karoline Leavitt, would you do it differently?" There was a pause, not for drama, for thought. Then Denzel smiled, softly, almost like he was remembering a private joke the world hadn't heard yet. "No," he said, "I don't regret it, because sometimes you have to perform one role better than you ever have, just to make the people pretending see themselves." The interviewer blinked. She wasn't expecting a metaphor. Denzel continued, "People think acting is about faking, but real acting? It's about holding truth in a way that the world can't ignore. And that day, I wasn't pretending to be brave. I was tired of pretending not to be angry." He folded his hands. "We live in a country where power hides behind performance every day, where cruelty comes dressed as conviction and indifference wears a smile. I stepped into that room as an actor, but I walked out as something else." He didn't say what. He didn't have to. The camera lingered on him for a beat longer, searching for something unscripted, and it found it in his eyes. Not pride, not revenge, just weight. The weight of having said what needed saying, knowing most men never get the chance. Karoline's name didn't come up again. She disappeared from the political landscape. No seat, no mic, no platform. A few op-eds, a minor podcast, a failed comeback attempt that fizzled out before it began. But her legacy had been rewritten, not by Denzel's hands, but by her own words, played back over and over in classrooms, law firms, and diversity seminars titled, "The Moment the Mask Slipped." And Denzel? He never returned to Washington, but Washington never left him. His legislation, the Bias Accountability Framework, had become the foundation for broader reforms. Training requirements for government communications, public speaking certifications, tied to ethical standards, even language review boards in 3 major departments. It didn't solve everything, but it changed the rules. And more importantly, it changed who got to write them. One night at a small middle school in Newark, a teacher played a clip from the hearing to her 8th grade civics class. Not the soundbite, the full exchange. When she asked what stood out, a student in the back raised his hand. He didn't yell, the boy said. He just stood. And in that moment, something clicked. It wasn't just what Denzel said. It was how he said it. He didn't need the final word. He was the final word. Back in the studio, the interview was wrapping. The lights dimmed. The crew began unplugging cords. The journalist leaned in, off mic now, and asked one last question, not for ratings, but for herself. "Do you still consider yourself an actor?" Denzel chuckled. "I think we're all actors. Some of us just know when to step off the stage." He stood, offered a handshake, and walked out of frame. No applause, no closing music, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but earned. Because in the end, it wasn't about the confrontation. It wasn't even about the law. It was about the moment a man chose not to perform, but to reveal. And in doing so, forced an entire nation to stop pretending it hadn't seen what it just saw. Because no one stays an actor forever. Eventually you play yourself. And when that day comes, the question won't be how you performed. It will be who you made visible when you did. In a world where noise is mistaken for truth, and performance often masks principle, one man reminded us that dignity doesn't need volume. It needs courage. Denzel didn't fight with fury. He stood with purpose. He showed us that real strength isn't in silencing others, but in standing still when the world tries to shrink you. Words carry weight. Silence does too. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to sit until every voice is heard and every story, no matter how inconvenient, is finally seen. Because justice isn't loud. It's just unshakable. If this story made you pause, don't just scroll. Share it with someone who knows that silence can be just as violent as words. Subscribe to Justice Unscripted, where we don't perform truth, we reveal it. Turn on the bell, because the next chapter won't be safe. It won't be polished. It'll be honest. And maybe, just maybe, it'll change how you speak power to its face. Now tell us, what moment stopped you cold? Was it the word? The silence? The standing? Drop it in the comments. Let's carry it together. This isn't just a story about Denzel. It's about every voice that was told to sit and chose to rise instead. Thanks for watching. And remember, real justice isn't rehearsed, it's lived. This is Justice Unscripted.